So thanks again for the invitation to talk this afternoon. I am the person who gets to speak and who gets their name on the poster and everything. But what I'm going to talk about is really a joint effort that came out from the work of a lot of different people. Principally among them, my colleague Chris Moore, who is a resident faculty at the Santa Fe Institute, Jessica Transick, who is at the Santa Fe Institute and is on the faculty at MIT, and my colleague Paul Hines, who violates the 24 hours in a day rule by being a part of the Santa Fe Institute and the University of Vermont. And he is the CEO of a startup called Packetized Energy, which is trying to basically trying to commercialize technology around a lot of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today. So the topic for today is related to a workshop that was run at the Santa Fe Institute just about a year ago. And our timing was incredibly fortuitous because we had this group of international experts on energy transitions, along with a lot of local knowledge, right? So folks from New Mexico state government, universities in New Mexico, some folks doing kind of project development in energy. So we had them all to the Santa Fe Institute, right, up in Santa Fe for a week. And about 10 days after the workshop finished, at least my state basically totally shut down because of COVID. So we were very, very fortunate that we were actually able to gather for this event. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the ideas that came out of this that came out of this interdisciplinary workshop. There was basically like a working paper, white paper that we released in October, which you can get from the Santa Fe Institute website, or you can email me if you'd like a copy of it. We had, we'd given some follow-on presentations to the State Water and Natural Resources Committee and the Public Regulation Commission in November. And so kind of what I'm going to talk about is very similar to the ideas that we discussed at the workshop and we had presented to, to these other groups in the state. So just as a slight digression, for those of you who are not familiar with what the Santa Fe Institute is, it's a transdisciplinary research institute which was founded a little over 35 years ago. That really, rather than focusing on discipline or something like that, the folks at the Santa Fe Institute and who are associated with it focus on complex systems. And so it's an inherently interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary institute. And it also has a very, very distributed model, right? So there's a limited number of people who work at the Santa Fe Institute campus full-time, but a lot of the Institute's activities involve a distributed network of scholars from a number of different fields, working in a number of different areas from all around the globe. And under normal circumstances, the Santa Fe Institute is, it's sort of like a physical hub or focal point for all of this international knowledge to convene. And so in addition to, hosting people who do research, the Institute holds a lot of kind of interdisciplinary research meetings and workshops like the one that spawned the report and this presentation. So kind of, and the the impetus for the workshop in Santa Fe, which is kind of part of a series of workshops that the Institute has run over the last number of years, focused on issues related to the power grid, was the adoption in New Mexico of a very ambitious, decarbonization initiative for electric power called the Energy Transition Act, right? And so the Energy Transition Act basically kind of sets a timetable or pathway for the state to go totally carbon-free in its electricity supply within the next 25 to 30 years, right? And so there are different intermediate targets and different kinds of targets for different kinds of utilities, but the basic idea is that all of the state's utilities will have to source electricity somehow from zero carbon electricity sources within a few decades, right? And so the Energy Transition Act focuses like very specifically on electricity, but it's part of a broader set of initiatives in the state to try to decarbonize the economy more broadly, right? And so in 2019, the governor signed an executive order that mandated a reduction in the carbon intensity of New Mexico's economy, which encompasses electricity, but is a little bit broader than that. And so this so these kinds of initiatives, right? And they take they take different forms in different places, but these kinds of initiatives are happening in the context of a much broader effort at decarbonizing electricity in particular in the United States, and energy more broadly. And so even in the absence of, like a strong federal policy approach related to climate policy, you have a number of different states, right? So in your region, it's not just New Mexico that has these ambitious goals, but Colorado has its own flavor of this, Arizona, Nevada, and there's others, and a number of other states around the country either already have adopted these kind of goals or are seriously considering them. So all of this is happening in the context of state policy. Utilities are also starting to realize that that different forms of carbon-free or low carbon or carbon reduced electricity goals are, one, not bad for ratepayers, right? Because the costs of these technologies are falling. But they're also, they're also reflecting things that their customers are demanding, right? And so the number of utilities, right, some of which have historically been very, very dependent on coal and natural gas, for example, to generate electricity, are sort of setting up their own, are setting up internal targets for themselves, right? And so one example of this is is a target that has been set up internally within Public Service of New Mexico to basically beat the Energy Transition Act target date for 100% carbon-free electricity. And then there are other utilities in the region that are sort of doing very, very similar things. And even, even some smaller utilities, right, are being very, very innovative in the way that they are trying to bring new technologies into their service territories, right? And so the Kit Carson Electric Co-op, which serves kind of the Taos area in northern New Mexico, is a pretty well-known example of a utility that's not big, right? It's not, certainly is not a PNM, but it has been doing very, very innovative things and has worked very hard to try to make its energy supply more sustainable. So there are all of these commitments being made, and they take various forms, targets, mandates, and there are different actors. But these commitments, it's very, very easy to get trapped in this mindset that these commitments are being made because they're going to achieve good social things, and they're being made with the acknowledgement that there's going to be some cost associated with them, right? So utilities are going to adopt wind and solar energy, and they're doing that because it's good for the environment locally, good for the environment globally, right? And it's very, very easy to sort of get sucked into this mindset that these decisions are being made despite the fact that or under the belief that they're going to increase costs for consumers, right? And so it's a very easy mindset to kind of get drawn into. It's not entirely correct, right? I'll sort of touch on this in a little bit, but in a lot of cases, these targets and mandates and other things are not likely to increase costs for consumers at all. But these targets and mandates, once you set them up, you create a lot of different opportunities, right? And you create a lot of different opportunities for innovation and economic development, and so the trick, or the key element, and this was kind of what our workshop last February wound up being a lot about. The key here is to kind of understand where the opportunities are, where companies and policymakers and others, can innovate or need to innovate, and to kind of figure out what sorts of deliberate decisions you need to make in order to take advantage of those opportunities, right? And there are a lot of these opportunities that have sort of arisen in New Mexico already. And in particular, one that was sort of particularly notable, that unfolded basically as we were writing the workshop report, and so it was very interesting to kind of see this in action, was kind of the way that the PRC, the Public Regulation Commission, went about considering replacement power for the San Juan generating station, right? So this was a big coal plant in northwestern New Mexico that even in the absence of the Energy Transition Act, PNM was probably going to have to shut down because it was old and was not terribly cost effective. And so the decision from the PRC was, that I think was influenced by the framework of the Energy Transition Act, was to replace the entirety of that coal-fired generating station with a mix of solar and battery energy storage, and also to kind of very deliberately have at least some of that replacement investment happen in area, basically in the area where the San Juan plant currently is, right? And so again, this was driven in part by the structure of the Energy Transition Act, which asks utilities and regulators, right, to consider local impacts when utilities are making planning decisions about how to get to 100% carbon free. But I think is a good kind of singular example of the kind of deliberate decision making that can take what we might ordinarily think of as something that's, you know, costly that you have to do for some kind of larger purpose, and to recognize that, you know, it really is an opportunity, and to seize on that in some way. And there are other examples of this that are emerging in the state, right? And they're not all about solar and batteries. There are some sort of very interesting proposals for pumped hydropower to help utilities with kind of very long-term energy storage. There are ideas to kind of repurpose some existing infrastructure to generate electricity using hydrogen instead of methane through different mechanisms that ultimately will be very, very low carbon, right? And so these are the sort of opportunities, right? And so there are opportunities that arise not just to kind of like basically to do innovative things with energy supply, but if you're going to be replacing lots of existing capital infrastructure with new infrastructure, and if we're going to be using more wind and solar, we need additional transmission investment to move that energy around. You're talking about a pretty sizable industrial effort, right? That is going to require it's going to require capital. It's going to require a lot of person power in order to achieve this, right? And so in addition to opportunities to replace existing higher carbon electricity or energy with lower carbon energy, there are other opportunities in using those commitments to improve local economic development, right? And so this is something that we have seen, for example, in the wind industry, right? So as different states have set up different structures to encourage utilities to invest in or build wind generation, there are these kind of like little innovation manufacturing ecosystems that have popped up in a number of different parts of the country. And typically these will involve partnerships. I'm sorry, was there a question? No, okay. And so typically these things will involve partnerships with utilities, wind manufacturers, higher education institutions who can, host training programs and other things like that. And so again, if you recognize these things and can make decisions towards them, there's sort of all sorts of different economic opportunities. Okay. And then finally, one of the sort of the big drivers of what utilities are starting to do is that customers, especially large utility customers, are starting to demand cleaner energy, right? And so the number of different kinds of renewable energy deals that very, very large corporations in the US have signed over the past several years has been rising, right? Utilities see that this is going on, and are starting to make adjustments in their own technology mix to match what their customers want. So kind of what companies, right, when they're making location decisions, want out of their, want out of energy systems really in these different locations is not just high reliability, low cost, right, which has been kind of the historical mantra going back decades, but increasingly what they're demanding is high reliability, low cost, and very, very clean, right? And so for New Mexico in particular, this is a very, I mean, this is a very good place for New Mexico to be, because the state is particularly blessed with a very, very high quality mix of both solar and wind energy resources, right? So the wind in New Mexico is very high quality, right? So it tends to blow fairly frequently in certain parts of the state, right? And solar is also very, very high quality in the state, right? And so, there's this sort of, there's this term that's sometimes thrown about for, for basically trying to attract companies with kind of just the right mix of, cheap, reliable, green energy, right, called greenshoring. And so this is sort of another area of potential for New Mexico to harness this framework that it's built, right, with the ETA and other, and other kinds of clean energy targets. So the question, and so one of the big questions that, we sort of, a lot of the discussions at our workshop last February revolved around is that there is a policy framework that is in place with the ETA and some other things. And so the question is, how do we achieve the goals that the ETA sets out, right? While at the same time being able to take advantage of all of these other opportunities, right? And so, earlier I alluded to the fact that in order to really take advantage of these, you have to make decisions very deliberately, right? And a lot of our discussions were around, okay, what kinds of decisions, need to be taken seriously in order for New Mexico to take advantage of all of these, of all of these opportunities. And there were a lot of ideas that we sort of talked about in the workshop, but they kind of came down under a few different themes, right? So one is that we need to foster an environment for innovation in the state, right? And this is not just innovation in technology, but this is innovation in how in how regulatory bodies look at decisions that utilities make, innovation in kind of the fundamental business models for for renewable energy companies, right? So it's not just technology, but it's innovation in industrial and regulatory processes as well. A second is to recognize that the ETA sets out a path for the decarbonization of the electric power grid, and we can use that decarbonization in electricity as a way to achieve broader decarbonization in other sectors of the economy, right? So we can, to basically like look to the decarbonized power grid, which is required by the Energy Transitions Act, and use that to look beyond the grid for other opportunities to make New Mexico's economy as a whole less carbon intensive. And then the last one is, is for New Mexico, even though it has its own goals and its own opportunities, to look not just within the state for solutions, but also to look cooperatively to to means for coordinating energy supply, energy transmission with other states, right? As a way to make this kind of this overall process of decarbonization, innovation, lower cost, higher reliability. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these, and then I will take some questions. Okay. So these are kind of like the three different kind of strategy spaces. Okay. So the first one is to think about fostering innovation whenever we can, right? And there the targets that are set out by the Energy Transitions Act alone involves, it's going to involve a lot of investment to get there, right? And so, it's going to take a lot of investment to get there. It's going to take a lot of investment in an environment where the kind of the enabling technologies, kind of fundamentally wind, solar, energy storage, right, are getting cheaper very, very quickly, right? And we also need, and we also need to be innovative in how we maintain the reliability of the grid, right? Because the utilities and regional grid operators have shown themselves to be really, really good at absorbing a lot of wind and solar, but the reality is that the resources are still variable, and there's and that variability is still something that grid operators are going to need to deal with, right? And so there are a lot of opportunities here in a number of different areas, right? So manufacturing, bringing the building sector, right, into the way that we think about the decarbonization of the grid and energy systems more broadly. And there's also a lot of opportunities for for more rural areas of this, more rural areas of New Mexico, right, and for Pueblos, tribes, and nations, right? So, one of the reasons that there are all these innovation opportunities is that technologies are getting cheaper, right? So the cost of solar power by the time I'm done with this talk is going to fall by another 50%. I mean, the cost declines have just been really, really, really astounding. Wind is also coming down in cost. And in a lot of, in a growing number of places, it is now less costly, right, in a kind of average cost over the lifetime of the project, the sort of metric that a utility would look at when deciding what kind of plants it's going to build. It's now often cheaper to build wind than it is to build natural gas, right? And so cost declines in wind and solar are making it easier for utilities to make the sort of adoption decisions that they are, right? And then at the same time, the complementary technologies are also getting much cheaper. So different battery technologies are falling in cost and will continue to fall in cost. Okay, and so those falling costs makes it easier for utilities to make adoption decisions, but there's there's only so far that hardware costs can fall, right? I mean, the hardware is always going to cost something, and for a lot of solar projects in particular, in advantageous places, the non-hardware, or what are sometimes called soft costs, so the costs of design, permitting, installation, interconnection, right? Basically the things that are not solar panels and racks and inverters, those are starting to make up a much larger fraction of the overall project cost in solar. And so in order to drive down costs even further, yes, you can get cheaper hardware with with additional deployment and manufacturing efficiencies and all that kind of stuff. But if we really want to continue to drive down the cost of solar, we are going to have to think about about strategies to reduce these kind of soft costs. And these costs are driven not just by like materials and manufacturing costs, but they're driven by the kinds of decisions that are made by a large number of different decision makers, right? So So what goes into the soft costs are driven by things like building codes, kind of like permitting and inspection requirements at different levels. So California, for example, has done something very innovative, right? To basically require solar, basically to require rooftop solar as part of as part of new as part of new building construction, right? My state of Pennsylvania, for example, has thousands and thousands of different local zoning codes, right, that apply to solar energy in different counties and municipalities, and and negotiating all of those different requirements, right, makes it sort of very, very hard for solar developers to increase efficiencies in deployment, right? So the kind of these kinds of non-hardware costs, those, there's a lot of innovation that's needed to reduce those kinds of costs. And we also need, and also we need to reduce what are called barriers to entry from different technologies, right? And so what this means is that, we need to basically figure out a way that we continue to, to allow utilities like PNM, right, to get paid to maintain the grid, but also to bring more distributed technologies and storage and other things, right, into the grid at different levels, right? So not just rooftop or community solar, and not just these these big solar projects like the one that will ultimately replace San Juan, right? But a portfolio of these things. And this is a very hard thing for utilities and their regulators to figure out, because historically utility regulation has been very, very risk averse, right? So the one thing that utilities and their regulators have feared, probably more than most things, over about the past 3 or 4 or 5 decades, is to make investments in technologies that ultimately don't pan out, and then somebody has to pay for it, right? And so as a result, the utility industry just hasn't been as innovative as it could be, right? And so utilities and their regulators need to figure out ways to encourage experimentation, right? Even if it leads to failure, as long as it leads to failure quickly, right? So that so that utilities and their customers don't get don't get bogged down in things that ultimately aren't going to pan out but take a long time. Okay. So there are also opportunities here to bring buildings into the picture, right? And there's a lot of innovative stuff here going on in New Mexico already. So the Santa Fe Community College, for example, has a number of different training programs that are aimed at at distributed energy efficiency, that are basically kind of they're training the workforce that is going to be needed for these kinds of investments, right? And the potential here is very large, right? And it's especially large in areas that are very, very poor, and where energy costs may kind of be a higher, maybe a higher household cost burden. Okay. And then, we also need to deal with variability in renewable energy output, right? And so there's all sorts of different timescales that we need to think about, right? Because wind and solar vary over minutes, hours, days, even seasons, and so there are kind of traditional technology solutions for this. but this is also where we can really engage the demand side, right, of the, of the electricity system, and where, where we can use increasingly efficient and, where we can use increasingly efficient and smart end-use devices, right, to basically help the grid kind of ride through those variations. Okay. The second one I want to talk about is kind of potential synergies between decarbonization in the grid and decarbonization in other areas, right? And so this is sort of the backdrop for this, which is the kind of the overall carbon intensity target for the state of, for the state of New Mexico to 2030. The other backdrop to this is that the state is in this position where its greenhouse gas footprint, it's changing very quickly, right? So electricity, even now, right, is not the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in New Mexico, right? And as as utilities make decisions under the Energy Transition Act, the kind of the focal point for meeting broader decarbonization targets is going to need to move from electricity, where this stuff is already happening, right, to oil and gas production, industry, transportation, and even agriculture. Okay. And this is a very big shift from the way that we have historically thought about decarbonization policy, right? So historically, we have had measures that we take, like the ETA, to decarbonize the power grid, and measures that we take to try to lower the carbon intensity of transportation and industry. But one of the really neat opportunities that happens when you decarbonize the power grid is that you can use that decarbonized grid to further energy transition and decarbonization in those other sectors, right? And this is a very important opportunity and critical way to kind of think about the decarbonization problem, because one of the things that we've realized, having spent a lot of effort in decarbonization of the power grid, is that it was relatively simple, right? It used, it leveraged existing infrastructure, and we were able to push down costs of new technologies. When you move into transportation and industry, those in some ways are harder, right? There are a lot more actors, right? We have about like a couple hundred coal-fired power plants in the United States and 300 million cars. So there's a lot of different actors. It's a little bit more of a complex problem than simply leveraging existing infrastructure to deliver lower carbon energy. You're talking about new industrial processes, new systems, and decarbonization in the grid can help you achieve that if you think about it the right way. So electrification, right, is that's a pretty clear way to use decarbonization in the grid to lower the carbon intensity of other areas. But there are other alternatives also. So hydrogen, and really integration of the demand side. Okay, and this is and the one thing I'll sort of emphasize here is that when you think about these synergies, it really is kind of a two-way street, right? You're not simply using a low carbon grid to decarbonize other sectors. Those low carb, those decarbonized investments that you make in other sectors, especially in especially in electrification, potentially in low carbon fuels, right, and in kind of smart devices, those can help. Those can also help keep the low carbon electricity grid stable, right? And it gives you, it potentially gives grid operators a much broader portfolio of resources to maintain grid stability when you have very, very high penetrations of, weather-dependent renewables.
Hey, Seth.
Yes.
We have about 5 minutes. Let's save a few minutes for question and answer.
Okay. All right. So I'll move on to the last part of this. So the sort of last piece of this is taking a more regional approach to operating and especially planning the power grid, right? And so this is thinking regionally for the power grid is basically a way to solve two problems or harness two opportunities. One is that it is really one of the best ways that we know of to achieve very high levels of renewable energy usage while maintaining a reliable grid, right? It has become very apparent as we have gotten experience with this over the past 15 years that there is this great diversity or portfolio effect that really smooths out a lot of fluctuations in renewables when you integrate them over large geographic areas, right? So it's like almost always windy somewhere, for example, okay? And then on the flip side, New Mexico is in this position where it has very, very high quality resources, but not a lot of demand, right? I mean, in terms of electricity demand, it's a pretty small state. And so thinking regionally about operation and planning of the power grid, right, is also a mechanism for New Mexico to harness more of its wind and solar resources, export that very, very high quality, low cost electricity to places with higher demands, right, and the same renewable energy targets, right, and create more economic opportunities. And so kind of this regional grid operator is one that has been adopted in a lot of different parts of the country, but for the most part, not in the Western US, right? And so, it's going to take some cooperation among policymakers and utilities in multiple states, right? And but it is one of the best ways that we know of reducing costs and increasing reliability, in order to meet renewable energy targets, right? And there are different ways of doing that, right? So you could have kind of a full-blown, basically unified Western grid, right, which is politically complicated because all the states have to cooperate, but would kind of sort of give you the best economic bang for your buck. Or you can think about this on a more regional scale, right? And there are discussions about about regionalization that are going on that are going on in the state right now. But it's an idea that I think is a good one, and hopefully will be carried forward. Okay, and so I'll stop there and take questions in the last 10 or 12 minutes. Well,
thank you, Seth. This has really been fascinating. I've been monitoring the chat. There's been an ongoing discussion that's probably as full of content as anything that you talked about. So rather than me try and be an intermediate, why don't people just unmute themselves and ask questions? Are there any questions or comments?
I've got a question. This is Orlin. I'm a grad student over at NMSU, and I'm interested in, my understanding of the ETA, and that this is a good outline, is this turning towards decarbonization by 2050, right? But I'm interested in how do we protect customers from shouldering the cost of what PNM has already promised, for the ETA. So we're going decarbonized by 2050. Actually, I think they're accelerating that. So how do we protect customers from shouldering the rates that PNM has already promised? So that's my question.
So that's a very good question. And you know, one of the things that you want utilities and their regulators to do is to you know, when they're making decisions about you know, about different technology investments, you don't want them to just look at what things cost now, right? You want utilities and their regulators to look at not just at what things cost now, but you know, what you would expect them to cost in the future, and to build those expectations into current decision making, right? And this is not really the way that utilities and their regulators have ever operated, right? I mean, they have,
Sure.
you know,
I think what I'm getting at is so PNM has this this idea to decarbonize in the future, and the last time they did this, so they did the San Juan generating station, and its customers paid the rates, so they shouldered the rates of getting this thing up and operational for their customers. Once that happens, they're promised some term of receiving energy from this location, but this acceleration means that doesn't go full term, which is great in the long term, but maybe in the short term, like, you know, because they're accelerating this decarbonization at San Juan, I see a potential for PNM to then offload their financial problems on their own customers. So that I guess maybe you're answering my question, but
yeah. So I mean, I think what you're getting at is something that in like utility jargon we sometimes call stranded costs, right? That you know, the concern that I think that you're expressing is how do we keep utility customers from bearing the costs of bad decisions that are made by the utility, right? Or decisions that turn out to be, you know, or decisions that turn out to have higher costs than necessary.
Yeah, and I think I'd be happy with even you know, anyone can chime in on this, but you know, name drop a Senate bill and I'll go look at it. You know, I don't know.
I would suggest that Athena would be a good person to talk about this.
Okay.
Yes, so the ETA addressed stranded costs, and the PRC helped make a decision that decarbonized PNM maybe even a little faster than they wanted. They kept them from having no new gas. I think you're talking about an issue that other groups have raised about it allowing maybe gas or maybe even nuclear to be put on us, and that ETA does not allow that. ETA, you know, I think there might be some discussion about Four Corners, but I will admit I'm an engineer, not a lawyer, so I'm not going to be the one to talk about that. And then there's certainly some discussion on that. As far as bills, I know there's a couple bills, and I bet Andrew might be able to come up with one of them that's talking about the ETA amendment. But as I think from the environmental groups perspective, we want to keep the RPS in place, and the fear is that once somebody starts talking about the ETA, unless we have something else in place, that we might lose that RPS, and it's been handy so far.
Right, and I would just add that ultimately we rely upon the Public Regulation Commission to balance the interests of the ratepayers and the investors. Ashok, did you have a comment? You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, I have a question for Seth. When you had this workshop in Santa Fe, and so you had this recommendation. So in that group, did you also include anybody, any representative from the PNM to, because you are doing a thing which has to be accepted by PNM also, otherwise it's not going to be successful in the long run. So do you, did you get a chance to also involve them or hear them, like what is there, how they want to solve this problem?
Yeah, so so there was somebody from PNM who attended the workshop, and so PNM is, I mean, it's a very kind of traditional utility company, right? And I think that I do genuinely think that they recognize that there are a lot of opportunities for them as a company, right, that come with the ETA, because there's a lot of stuff that's going to need to get built, right, in order to meet the ETA's targets. So I think that, I do think that they recognize that there are opportunities, but I think it's also the case that for for some ways that the state can make the most of can make the most of this decarbonization process is going to require some regulatory pressure, right? So I think for example, to move towards kind of a more regionally planned power grid, right, is something that I would not really expect PNM or frankly any utility to decide to do all on its own, right? I mean, these are decisions that can be broadly beneficial, but very often need like a legislative or regulatory nudge.
Okay, yeah, I would like to see, if possible, I'd like to see that report that you have produced. It should be very interesting. So when you get a chance.
You might also want to look at what PNM is saying for their future. They do an integrated resource plan, and you may want to take a look and see what they're saying.
One thing that I've seen, and please let me know if I'm wrong with this, that the shutting down of the San Juan generating station and replacing it with solar and batteries seems to have saved ratepayers money on their bills. I think it's like $7 or $8 per year. I think it's per year, despite the fact that the investors are not being docked for their stranded assets. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
So it's really been a win-win situation so far. It's really been.
So whoa, say that again, Walter. Hold on.
That both the ratepayers and the investors made out like bandits under the shuttering of the San Juan generating station.
In the sense, yes, that PNM did calculate the cost of keeping it up and running. Yes, absolutely.
And so,
yeah,
if we see this kind of success in the future, that looks like a pretty good shift that's happening because of this legislation, the ETA.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly get the sense that the ETA was very influential in the commissioner's determination, right, on the replacement power for San Juan. One thing that I would, one thing that I'll say is that, in a sense, the San Juan decision was relatively easy. As you kind of move on that decarbonization curve, right? Then it is, as you move along that decarbonization curve, right? And you are going to need to think more about complementary resources to deal with variability and maintain grid reliability and all of that kind of stuff. Some of these incremental replacement decisions or new build decisions are going to become, they're going to become more difficult economically. And so, and this is part, you know, I mean, this is the, and so this is part of the reason that, you know, in the workshop discussion and in the report, we're sort of really, you know, we're sort of really urging utilities and their regulators to think about how what have been very kind of non-traditional utility resources, right? So like the building energy sector, right? How innovations in those sectors can be harnessed to reduce those costs of, you know, meeting the ETA's goals as you walk along that decarbonization curve.
Okay, I would like to say that we've gone for an hour, and so if people would like to drop off, they're fully justified in doing that. If people want to hang on and ask Seth questions, that's fine. I'd like to thank you, Seth, for a very inspiring and well-informed talk. It was really good. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
You are most welcome. It was great to be invited to talk.
Okay.
And someday I'll get to come back to New Mexico again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. No, people aren't ready.
Thanks, we appreciated it.
Okay, so what is next? I mean, are we going to?
If there's any more questions.
If there's a couple more questions, I can take
Larry,
a couple
Larry
more.
has a question. You need to unmute yourself, Larry. Oh, I guess he was saying goodbye.
Oh, okay.
So
I have a question.
Yeah.
What about renewable energy for industrial heat sources? What's going on with that in New Mexico and elsewhere?
So I don't know about New Mexico in particular. I mean, I can't talk about specific projects in New Mexico in particular. I think there, you know, I think so technologies like combined heat and power, for example, right, are, you know, those are examples of how, you know, how like industrial loads can be made much more efficient. Most CHP right now does operate on natural gas, right? And so this is one of those areas where it, you know, we can get more efficient using conventional fuels, but to get all the way to electricity, or to find a way to use, you know, like a zero carbon fuel for an application like CHP, that's sort of both a challenge and an innovation opportunity. Somebody in the chat just said something about heat pumps, right? Which for, you know, residential commercial applications have a lot of potential, right? Because they, you know, because like cold climate heat pumps have gotten really, really efficient, and they're kind of exactly the kind of very, very flexible electric load that you could use to provide more stability to the grid as a whole.
I was thinking more about aluminum and things like that, manufacturing processes, maybe hydrogen as a fuel source as an alternative to natural gas.
There's a report from Bloomberg that I could dig up and provide to the group that looks at how low the electricity rates would need to be for electricity to compete with a number of things like aluminum smelting and other high energy intensity things, which of course we don't have that much of that kind of industry here in New Mexico, but it's still an interesting report. I don't remember the numbers. I can try to find it. You know, but
I'd be interested in that.
Yeah.
Right now in New Mexico, we produce brick and we produce cement using natural gas. And it looks to me and Athena, we have a company that's been looking at combined heat and power, like electricity is poised to be very competitive with natural gas and direct sunlight and wind.
Oh yeah, Heliogen, isn't it Heliogen that's trying to do some industrial heat with like concentrating solar power?
Yes.
It's basically taking the sunlight and storing it as heat and then converting it to what electricity,
That's right.
or just keeping it heat. What am I saying?
That's right. Sun to heat, and then also sun to electricity.
And can some of these things also, you could use green hydrogen and burn that for certain applications?
We haven't looked at green hydrogen, and let's make sure we understand what green hydrogen is. I'm thinking green hydrogen is from electrolysis, in which you take water and split the oxygen and the hydrogen. Okay,
Yeah,
good,
so
because there's been a lot of talk about green hydrogen.
Green
and
versus blue versus gray hydrogen. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, if it comes from anything fossil fueled, it's not green anymore.
What Europe apparently is doing is they're planning green hydrogen, but for now they're mixing it with natural gas, which is dangerous because we need to cut down on natural gas.
Yeah.
It's really bad for the for climate.
Yeah.
Okay, are there anybody else want to have one last comment or question? If not, then I think we should thank our speaker again. And also there is going to be another talk on February 22nd on heat pumps. New Mexico Solar Energy Association and 350.org are collaborating on this next talk. So that'll be a good one to come to. And
Do we have a link yet that we can point people to? Do we have a link that we can point people to? I think Steffi, you had.
Ashok, can you make sure that everybody gets adequate?
We are doing that. Is it not? Is it who's hosting it? NMSEA or 350?
350.
350 is going to host it.
Oh, okay.
But Steffi, if you can get the word out, that'd be great.
I'm going to get the link. Just a second.
Okay. So again, Seth, thank you very much again for such a great talk, and hope that we'll be in touch in the future.
All right. Thank you again.
Thank you, Seth. Yes.
All right. Thank you. It was nice meeting Chris and Seth, and it was kind of, I see everybody's names.
Ashok, will you save the chat?
Okay, so what I think
I think if you can save it, that would be very interesting. And I guess we'll post the recording on
yes, on our website.
If you go to our Facebook pages, it'll be there.
You got any openings, Chris? You seem a little passionate about this particular topic.
Sorry, you mean job openings at the Institute?
Yes.
That's above my pay grade, I'm sorry, but we certainly hope to have some follow-up meetings.
Okay.
And if you get a chance to look at the report, either the executive summary, the whole thing, you know, I think there's, for experts like yourselves, there's, you know, I would be surprised if there's anything in there that you didn't already know, but we're very interested in learning more about what we ought to emphasize and where some techie people can have a positive impact in the state and the region on policy questions here. So, you know, we'd love to get your feedback. And I guess Seth posted the link, and if for some reason you don't get it, I'm easy to find. And so anyway.
Great.
Thank
you. Well, Athena, I'm on the event page and I don't see the link.